US President Trump is more optimistic than ever. He says the war talks could resume this weekend in Pakistan and the deal is close. Day 48 of the Middle East conflict, and the President of the United States has never sounded more certain that the end is in sight. And yet, the Lebanon ceasefire is 10 hours old, and the Lebanese army is already reporting Israeli acts of aggression. Netanyahu says his troops are not leaving the 10-kilometer security zone. Hezbollah says occupation gives Lebanon the right to resist. Between Trump's optimism and Israel's posture, the gap has never been wider, and the world is asking whether any deal can hold while Israel behaves the way Israel is behaving. In Paris this afternoon, Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron are chairing a virtual meeting of around 40 countries. The agenda? A multinational mission to reopen the Strait of Hormuz when the war ends. Notably, the initiative is explicitly separate from Trump's blockade. Britain and France are building an alternative architecture. Two of America's closest allies, quietly routing around Washington. I am Zunaira Azhar, and you're watching Decode, where we define and analyze the stories shaping our world. Tonight, three stories. The optimism of a president whose own deal architecture depends on an ally, Israel, that may not let it close. The 40-country meeting in Paris that says more about the transatlantic relationship than anyone in Washington has yet admitted. And at the end of the show, a tribute to a meme republic, to its people who continue to laugh despite real anxieties. Let us decode the night. Donald Trump told an audience in Las Vegas this week that the war in Iran is going swimmingly and should be ending pretty soon. He has told reporters that talks with Iran could resume within 2 days. He said Washington is, in his words, more inclined to go to Pakistan for the next round. He has praised Pakistan's Army Chief Asim Munir as the Field Marshal doing a great job. The same Field Marshal he has previously described as his favorite. And the White House has confirmed that the administration feels good about the prospects of a deal. When Trump speaks in conclusions as he does, it puts pressure on every other actor in the room to behave as if the deal Trump describes is the deal that exists. Tehran cannot easily walk away from talks the American president has publicly announced are almost done. But whether or not it's true for Israel is yet to be seen. And the underlying movement is real. Field Marshal Munir met with Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Baqir Ghalibaf, Iran's chief negotiator on this file. Iran's foreign ministry has said the release of billions of dollars in frozen Iranian assets is being discussed as part of a potential deal. Pakistan is shuttling between Tehran, Riyadh, and now Antalya, where Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar are meeting Saudi, Turkish, and possibly Egyptian counterparts at the Diplomacy Forum today. On the Lebanon front, at midnight last night, a 10-day ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon came into force. The agreement was brokered by Donald Trump and Marco Rubio after a flurry of phone calls between Washington, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and Lebanese President Joseph Aoun. It followed the first direct diplomatic engagement between Israel and Lebanon in decades, a meeting between the two countries' ambassadors in Washington on April 14th. Two countries that have technically been at war since 1948, sitting in the same room for the first time in over 30 years. The truce is supposed to halt Israel's offensive against Hezbollah inside Lebanon, but the violations have already begun. Lebanese state news has confirmed that Israeli artillery continued shelling areas in south of Lebanon an hour after the truce began. The IDF has issued an Arabic-language warning telling civilians not to move south of the Litani River until further notice. The picture is not of a ceasefire taking hold. It is of a ceasefire being tested and bent in real time. Israel's track record on ceasefires across the past 2 years is not a record of compliance. It is a record of partial pause where the ceasefire is signed. The withdrawal is delayed. The buffer zone becomes permanent. The strikes resume under the heading of self-defense. And by the time the international community notices, the ceasefire is dead and a conflict has begun. So we have two things happening simultaneously, and the contradictions between them are the story. Trump is announcing peace. Israel is reserving the right to break it. And the ceasefire in Lebanon, 10 hours old only, is already a proof. Trump's optimism is not by itself a dishonest thing. The signals from Tehran are real. Pakistan's mediation is real. The pressure on Iran is real. The fact that the Iranian foreign minister is saying the word peace is real. But on Trump's optimism, Tehran is partly playing along. Pakistan is fully playing along. Hezbollah is conditionally playing along, and Israel is not playing along at all. The wider context matters here. Iran wanted the Lebanon ceasefire. Iran wanted the Lebanon ceasefire. According to Al Jazeera, from Washington, Tehran communicated to United States that it could agree to an extended Iran and US deal, but only if Lebanon stopped first. That is the actual reason Trump pushed both sides into a room. Not because Lebanon by itself was a priority, because Lebanon was the door to Iran. Hezbollah had to stand down for Tehran to come back to the table, and Hezbollah only stands down if Tehran tells it to. That is the architecture of this moment. The Lebanon ceasefire is the price of admission to a possible Iran deal, and Israel knows it. Israel signed because Trump asked. Israel did not withdraw because Netanyahu cannot afford to be seen by his coalition as having withdrawn. The result is a structure that gives every actor what they need on paper and gives almost no one what they need on the ground. There is another paradox underneath this. Israel, despite being militarily a stronger regional player with Hezbollah and Hamas degraded, Iran having lost its top leadership, Syria and Iraq being paralyzed, decimated, and remains a dominant force in the region. Israel has never been less popular in its own allies. The countries that armed it, defended it, and traded with it, 60% of Americans are now unfavorable. 3/4 of French people are disapproving of it. The European political class is openly building post-war structures that bypass the American-Israeli axis. The Arab world has hardened against the normalization, not softened. The military victories are real, yet the political costs are accumulating against Israel. And this is the question I want to put to our guest, is how long the American public is ready to absorb the cost of being the country that defends a country it increasingly does not approve of. Pew Research Center says confidence in Trump's handling of US-Iran policy is at 35%. The recovery time for American society from this war, for its public opinion, for its standing in the world, for the truest of its young voters who watched it happen on their phones, is going to be measured in years, possibly decades. And the political class in Washington has not yet begun to reckon with that. Israel is reserving the right to break the ceasefire because that is what Israel has done at every ceasefire in our living memory. Lebanon's displaced families are driving home into a zone the IDF is telling them not to enter. The optimism is real by the President Trump. The structural problem is also real. Both can be true, and in the next 10 or so days, we will find out which one wins. Let us bring our guest in. We have Idris Ali with us, who covers national security, focusing on the Pentagon and the US military. Reported extensively on defense policy and global conflicts, and has broken several key stories on US national security. Idris, great to have you with us. President Trump says the war is going swimmingly and that talks could resume this weekend in Pakistan. Iran is also reportedly discussing the release of its frozen assets. How real is this optimism in your opinion, and how much of it is performance designed to lock the parties into one room to make them behave as if the deal is inevitable?
Thanks for having me on. So I think, over the course of the last 45 days or so since the war has begun, there has not been a lot of optimism in Washington about what is going on in terms of the war. President Trump obviously almost every day says that things are going quite well. The reality has been that the war has been a tough one for both sides, and the United States, has been able to achieve some of its military objectives, but the broader strategic objectives have not really been met, and that includes, the Iranian government, which is largely in place, even though the supreme leader was killed during the first day of the war. So there really hasn't been much optimism. But I do think going into this weekend and next week, the sense of optimism is quite real in Washington and other capitals around the world. And I think that is partially based on the fact that neither side, neither Washington nor Tehran really want this to start up. The ceasefire expires on April 21st, and when when there is a ceasefire, when there is a pause, it's really not in anyone's interest for it to go back to the status quo of fighting. And so I think that is driving some of the optimism. It's more optimistic from my sources than I've seen since the war started.
Do you think Lebanon is part of it? In fact, the ceasefire that is being imposed there now, although it's only 10 to 12 hours old and Lebanese army is already reporting that there are violations by Israeli army. Netanyahu says that IDF will remain in a 10-kilometer security zone. Hezbollah says that occupation gives Lebanon the right to resist. From the perspective of how previous Israeli ceasefires have unfolded in Gaza or in the southern part of Lebanon in 2024, what does the at any time self clause actually mean, in your opinion?
No, you bring up a really good point. Look, I think Lebanon has been a key part of this for Iran in terms of getting some sort of deal. And I think the ability through Pakistan for the United States to be able to push Israel to come to a ceasefire, I think is really important. And it shows, going back to your previous question, I think that shows the level of seriousness for the Iran-US talks going forward. I think, part of this is Israel has to sell this ceasefire to its public, and they've put in clauses like the one you just mentioned into this sort of ceasefire agreement. And so it's far from perfect. It's probably not what the Lebanese would have loved, but I think it goes further than they were previously. So I think, look, imperfect, but it sort of speaks to the broader issue, right? It shows that the United States is willing to put pressure on Israel, does have leverage with Israel in this instance, and it shows, I think, to Iran that the U.S. is making an effort to bring this war to an end.
Well, looking at Israel's historical pattern when it comes to the ceasefires, what makes you think that Netanyahu will comply this time?
I think there is one factor and one factor only, and that is President Trump. Look, Israel's closest partner, military and otherwise, is the United States, and it's very tough for them to carry out wars on multiple fronts with Iran and Hezbollah and potentially in Gaza all at the same time without the support of the United States. So, the ceasefire, even if the terms don't spell it out, I think there is one main check on the Israelis, and that is President Trump. And he has shown and I think Prime Minister Netanyahu has shown this as well, is he is not willing to cross President Trump, because if President Trump is unhappy or angry, I think it could really have an impact on the U.S. support for Israel militarily and economically. So I think that is the main check in this case. You're right. In previous decades, ceasefires haven't always gone according to plan, but I think there was no President Trump. And I think his presence here, I think, is another factor that might help sort of the ceasefire go along in a way that might not have a few years ago.
Israel has its own internal realities and some external realities, some ideological connotations to this war as well. Do you think that the far right flank that Netanyahu represents would agree to all of this?
You're right. I mean, look, there was a lot of anger in Israel yesterday within the Israeli cabinet when President Trump announced this ceasefire. And I think that sort of anger is going to continue, probably become worse. But I think they are willing to accept this in some way, shape, or form. Because don't forget, look, Israel has been at war since October 7th. 2023. And so that is a long time to be, as a society, in conflict,
do you think it's a fatigue?
In war.
They also need a pause.
Look, I think just as a society, right, once you're at war, it really takes a toll. It's taking an economic toll on Israel. And I think at some point, the people will say enough is enough. And look, Benjamin Netanyahu is, been delaying his bribery charges against him year after year, month after month, and day after day, in part with the argument, look, there's a conflict ongoing. I cannot be a part of this. And I think a lot of politicians, the opposition party, said, look, you need to face the charges. The wars need to stop so we can get back to reality.
I have Pew data in front of me, that research center, which shows that 60% of Americans now hold an unfavorable view of Israel, up nearly 20 points since 2022. and 59% have no confidence in Netanyahu. Ipsos shows 75% French disapproval of Israel. The Arab Opinion Index shows 87% opposition to normalization. How long does it take for a country to recover from being seen by the majorities of population across allied democracies as the partner in something this destructive?
Yeah, no, again, really interesting data, right? Look, we've seen since the war in Israel's war in Gaza, the popularity of Israel in the United States really plummet. And I think the one segment it's really affected is young Americans. And I think the popularity of Israel amongst young Americans has really taken a hit. And the Israeli diplomats, Israeli officials I've talked to are really concerned about this because it's not just low ratings for this year or for next year. It shows a generational shift in the United States, and I think they are really concerned about what this means for the future, right? The future leaders of the United States are growing up with negative views of Israel, and I think they're very, very concerned on that. I don't think this is something you can reverse very quickly. I think it takes a long, long time to reverse, and I think being at war in the Middle East for Israel probably is not helping those ratings go up.
Weaving it together, if Trump gets his weekend deal, let's say, if Iran signs, if Lebanon holds, does Israel's structural problem with its internal and external realities go away, even partially? And is there a guarantee involved that there is not going to be another war?
Yeah, look, for Israel, I think, they have made pretty significant strides when it comes to diplomacy in the region with the Abraham Accords with the United Arab Emirates and some of the other countries. And I think if the war ends, it allows that sort of issue, that sort of diplomacy to come back to light. Then the questions become, well, is Saudi Arabia and other countries willing to go with the Abraham Accords? So I think it will put sort of Israel and Israel's trajectory back on diplomacy in the region and maybe allow for more integration. There are structural problems, like you said, within Israel. I think there are still lots of questions about what happened on October 7th and how something like that within Israel, right? There are questions about how that could have happened. So I think there's going to be, once this ends and once there's a deal, once it's permanent, I think there's going to be a lot of soul searching in Israel, asking how did this happen? Who are we after this conflict? And how do we go as a society going forward?
The last question that comes to my mind is, would it matter if in this election cycle Netanyahu is not there and someone else is there? Would the policy change?
I think, look, Netanyahu is a larger than life figure when it comes to not just Israeli politics, but global politics. So I think, if in future elections, if for whatever reason he is no longer the prime minister, I think that would fundamentally shift Israel's outlook because really since for a few years, Israel has been on a war footing. And that leader, in many instances, not just this war, but previous wars, has been Benjamin Netanyahu. So I think it's going to allow Israel to sort of rethink how they are seen on the global stage, how they are seen in the Middle East, and, how their military sort of and their sort of strategy fits into this because, by far, Israel is the strongest military in the Middle East.
In the region, yeah.
And so I think they are going to sort of like post Netanyahu think, we obviously have to be strong, but do we need to be as involved in many of these instances? How does the policy in Gaza look different, right? Does the policy in the West Bank look different? And part of this is not going to just depend on Benjamin Netanyahu not being there, but who comes next. I think a lot is going to depend on that.
Idris Ali, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure having you. So Trump is optimistic. Israel is keeping its options open. The Lebanon ceasefire is fragile by design. And the Iran deal, if it is signed this weekend, will be signed in Pakistan, with Pakistan carrying the message. But while Washington waits for Islamabad to close a deal, something else is happening in Paris. Something that has been mostly underplayed in the American media coverage. Two of the closest allies of the United States, Britain and France, have just convened 40 countries to build a post-war architecture for the Strait of Hormuz that explicitly does not include Trump's blockade. They are planning without him. And that is a story in itself. After a break. The Paris meeting is the diplomatic event of the day, maybe decades, and it is being underplayed in the American coverage for an obvious reason. It says something that Washington is not yet ready to hear out loud. So, what does this mean? Is this a quiet realignment? Let's decode. For most of the past 80 years, the answer to a major maritime security problem has been America leads, allies follow. America deploys its carriers, allies contribute. America writes the framework, and allies sign on it. That is the model. And that model has now visibly been broken. Not because the allies are hostile, because the allies are wary. Trump's blockade is widely seen in European capitals as an escalation without an exit strategy. Joining it would mean joining the war. Not joining it means being called out by name by the American president. The Paris meeting is the way through, allies demonstrating that they are doing something, at least, while refusing to do the specific thing Washington has asked. There are at least three messages in this meeting. The first is to Tehran, that the world is preparing a post-war order for the Strait, and that Iran's conduct in the post-war order will shape what access it has to global shipping insurance and markets. The second is to Washington, that its allies are willing to work with it, but not under it, and that the assumption of an automatic American leadership in crisis response can no longer be taken for granted. The third is to their own publics, that something is being done, and that the cost of the war is being managed by someone who has their interests in mind. It is a subtle message, but subtle messages are how these shifts show up before they become loud. In 2003, Europe split with Washington over Iraq loudly. In 2026, Europe is splitting with Washington over Hormuz quietly, procedurally, through the convening of a 40-country initiative with its own planning headquarters. The effect over time may be larger. Let's bring our guest in on what Paris is actually doing and what it means for the transatlantic relationship over the next decade with US. We have with us Paul Fritsch, a former US diplomat and former senior NATO and OSCE official, now serving as a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, Switzerland. Thank you so much, Paul, for joining us. I think let's start with Trump, who is very optimistic about the talks, which according to him could resume this weekend in Pakistan. Iran is reportedly discussing the release of frozen assets. How close do you think this optimism is as compared to what's on ground? Are we genuinely close to a signed framework, or are we in the part of the process where everyone announces progress to keep the room open?
Negotiators are in the room together and we see what's actually on the table. Yes, President Trump over the past several days has been extremely optimistic about the outcome, but I think, as we all know, having observed President Trump for his time in public life over the past decade, he tends to be fairly optimistic about most things. And sometimes that's justified, sometimes it's not. If I look at the substance of where the two sides are at the end of the last round of negotiations in Islamabad, they were quite far apart. We were starting to see the possible outlines of a framework agreement where the U.S. side had proposed a 20-year moratorium on uranium enrichment.
Yeah.
And the Iranian side had countered that with an offer for a 3-year moratorium. If that were where the negotiations stood at the beginning of the second round, that's the kind of a difference that professional diplomatic teams can bridge. But unfortunately, what we've seen since then is that President Trump has pulled back even from the 20-year offer and is insisting on a permanent ban on enrichment. That seems to be unrealistic and something that the Iranian side is unlikely to accept at this second round. So we'll see what happens. These are complicated issues. And I think, as in the first round, the best that we can hope for would be some forward progress and an agreement to extend the ceasefire and continue a negotiating process aimed at addressing remaining issues.
On the Lebanon side, the ceasefire is hardly 10 to 12 hours old, and the Lebanese army is already reporting that Israel is violating it. From the perspective of how previous Israeli ceasefires have unfolded in Gaza or in the south of Lebanon in 2024, how is this arrangement different from the previous ones, looking at the pattern that Israel has on ceasefires?
Well, I think this arrangement is different from prior ceasefire arrangements in Gaza because it involves an agreement between Israel and another sovereign state, Lebanon. But I think it's also different in that the entity with which Israel was fighting, which is Hezbollah, which is not the Lebanese government, is not at the table, was not involved in these negotiations, and it's still an open question as to the degree that they'll consider themselves to be bound by it. We've seen in the aftermath of the first round of the Islamabad talks between the US and Iran that Iran very much wants to include Lebanon in a global ceasefire. Yes. So there is some incentive on the side of Hezbollah to abide by a ceasefire. But as you've mentioned, it's also unclear that Israel is abiding by the terms. So this is a very fragile arrangement in its very early stages. And we'll see how that develops over the coming days and weeks.
Well, coming from your NATO experience, Britain and France are co-hosting a meeting of 40 countries in Paris on the Strait of Hormuz, explicitly outside Trump's blockade. And they say it is defensive in nature, it is for after the conflict ends. How significant is this structurally, and what does it tell us about how European allies now see American leadership in all this?
Well, I think it's very significant in a number of ways. I think that, first of all, we have to acknowledge that Europe is highly dependent upon energy supplies that run through the Strait of Hormuz, and more broadly on energy that's produced in the Gulf region that has been interrupted or under serious threat as a result of this conflict. As you mentioned, these are discussions for long-term arrangements once the current conflict is resolved, in order to put in place some sort of multilateral arrangement to guarantee the freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. They are not discussions on possible participation in any sort of military operation to force the opening of the strait. So these are discussions for the long term. But I think the very fact that Europeans are conducting this discussion among themselves without the participation of American representatives and outside the NATO framework, I think is significant in itself, and I think is indicative of a broader loss of confidence in American leadership within NATO.
Is this a signaling, or as the Bloomberg is framing it, is that Europe is trying to contain Trump's fury because he has been furious? The UK and France have convened this initiative while simultaneously refusing to join the American blockade. Is this a diplomatic push? Is this some sort of answer? Is this a diplomatic calculation that we have not seen in decades from Europe? How do you look at it?
Yes, I think it's all of the above. I think we saw this, the first partner, the first ally to try this was the Prime Minister of Japan, who sent this signal during her recent visit to Washington a couple of weeks ago, where she was being urged to participate in the military operation against Iran, and responded by saying that, of course, Japan would be willing to participate in a post-conflict arrangement to patrol the Strait of Hormuz. And I think that at the time was a very clever response, which avoided some very uncomfortable questions. I think it would have been difficult to envision both logistically and legally how Japan might have participated in an active military campaign against Iran. But by shifting the focus to the long term and making a commitment to participate in an international arrangement to guarantee the long-term navigability of the strait, I think that was a very clever response. And I think Europe has been trying to emulate that.
Do you think Europe is finally waking up, repositioning itself after Ukraine, after Trump's second term, the way he treated all of them in the Oval Office?
Well, yes, I do. But I think the key moment in that awakening was the crisis over Greenland in the first weeks of this year. And I think that was a clear signal to Europe that the approach that they had largely taken in the first year of this second Trump administration, which was to try to flatter and appease the president, was not necessarily working, and that they had to show a certain amount of unity and toughness in order to establish the basic parameters of the relationship.
40 countries is a big number, Paul. Germany, Italy, South Korea, all these officials across Europe, Asia, and Middle East. How do you look at the Middle Eastern countries in all this?
Well, the Middle Eastern countries are in a very difficult position, and I don't think that you can look at them as a monolith. Saudi Arabia, I think, has clear strategic as well as economic interests. The Gulf states, who've had their own civilian and energy infrastructure under threat, certainly have an interest in the resolution of the conflict and the putting into place of long-term arrangements to guarantee the region's security and the reliability of the energy supply chain. So I think there are different interests across the region, but I think everyone has an interest in seeing this conflict come to some sort of stable conclusion, and to see the energy supply chain restored to some semblance of what it was before the conflict.
Looking ahead, is it some sort of recalibration and realignment coming from all of the regions who have suffered because of this blockade, or even before that, the way Iran has handled the Strait of Hormuz?
Yeah.
Is this a recalibration geopolitically happening all across the globe?
I don't know that it's so much a calculated recalibration as it is a reevaluation of many of what had been prior to the conflict underlying assumptions of the security environment. I think many countries in the region are going to have to reevaluate their approach to relations with Iran. Mm-hmm. And I think the content of that reevaluation will depend upon how the conflict is resolved and what kind of what kind of regime emerges in Iran, and how they approach the questions of regional and global security. I think that the basic defense paradigm for many of the countries in the region is under question. I think the simple mathematics of shooting down $20,000 drones with $2 to $4 million interceptors, I think is going to cause questions.
The magazine depth problem that has come out as...
and the supply chain problem. I think that
so the combination is moving the countries.
Yes, I think there are going to be long-term strategic implications of this conflict based simply on the burn rate of what we call here in Washington low-density, high-demand systems, such as the Patriot PAC-3, the THAAD missile interceptors. And I think these are going to have implications well beyond the Middle Eastern region, because they're going to affect the quality of the U.S. deterrent in places like the Indo-Pacific, in supporting the defense of Taiwan, of South Korea, of Japan. They're going to have implications in Europe, because these are the kinds of systems that European allies were purchasing from the United States for transfer to Ukraine. Yeah. And I think they're going to have implications for the Gulf. I think many states in the Gulf have been studying the Ukrainian experience in developing low-cost alternatives to air defense and missile defense. And I think those are going to be in quite high demand after this conflict.
Paul Fetch, thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure having you on our show. This was today's Decode. See you next week.